Cheap bread. In point of fact, no bread is so really cheap as that composed entirely of good wheat flour or meal, because there is none which affords the same amount of pure, wholesome, strength-sustaining nourishment, and a larger quantity will generally be required of any inferior kind to support, in an equal degree, the powers of life. But when the price of wheat is very high, it is sometimes impossible for poor families to obtain a sufficiency of it fully to satisfy the appetite. And in such cases, any of the following receipts, which have all been well proved, may be had recourse to with advantage. Potato bread. This is one of the best varieties of mixed or cheap bread when it is made with care, as its flavor is excellent, and it remains moist longer than any other except rice bread. But the potatoes used for it should be good, thoroughly boiled, well dried afterwards by having the water poured from them, and then standing by the side of the fire to steam, and be reduced to a perfect paste by mashing, or be rubbed quickly through a colander or other coarse strainer. They should be perfectly mixed with the flour or meal while they are still warm, and after the addition of rather more salt than for common bread, the dough, which will require less liquid than wheaten dough, should be made up smoothly and firmly, and be managed afterwards like other bread, but be baked in a more gentle oven. 7 pounds of potatoes, weighed after they are cooked and peeled, may be added to each gallon of meal or flour. Should it be necessary, from circumstances that cannot be controlled, to use such as are watery, the moisture may be partly wrung from them, in a warm, thick cloth, before they are mixed with the other ingredients. Bread of Indian corn, rye, and wheat meal. Dark-colored but very nutritious and by no means unpalatable bread may be made with equal parts of wheat meal, maize flour, and rye flour, and it will also be cheap as regards the price of the ingredients and profitable from the weight of the bread produced by them. Persons accustomed, as the English people are, to live habitually on wheaten bread only, do not immediately become reconciled to any other, and the flavour of Indian corn, being dissimilar to that of any grain which is common amongst us, is often not relished by them at first. But a taste for it is very soon acquired. 3 pounds each of the maize, the rye flour, and the wheat meal, with 2 not large teaspoonfuls of salt, 1/4 of a pint of thick yeast, and about or nearly 2 quarts of warm liquid, thoroughly mixed and well kneaded into a smooth dough, which should stand to rise until it is unmistakably light, both before it is kneaded down and again previously to being sent to the oven, will produce 12 pounds of substantial, satisfying bread, well suited to stay the demands of hunger, and perfectly wholesome in its nature. It may be divided into 3 loaves, and should be baked in a well-heated but not fierce oven. Flour of maize or Indian corn, 3 pounds, rye flour, 3 pounds, wheat meal, 3 pounds, salt, 2 teaspoonfuls, thick yeast, 1/4 pint, water or milk and water, about 2 quarts, product in bread, 12 pounds. Observation. Especial care should be taken to have all the materials for this bread in a perfectly sound condition, for if overkept or carelessly stored, either the maize or rye flour may impart to it a very unpleasant taste, and so create a prejudice against the bread itself. which is unobjectionable when properly prepared, and in times of real scarcity would be a very valuable help to those who might find it difficult to obtain sufficient food without some such substitute for their accustomed diet. Potatoes might supply the place of the maize flour on occasion, but they are by no means so nutritious. Barley flour, too, might sometimes be used instead of rye. A skillful bread maker would soon find it easy to combine various cheap ingredients and prepare with them very good bread. But the nature of each and the effect which it produces should be attentively observed, that the yeast and liquid may be correctly apportioned to them, and the baking also be well regulated. French bean bread. The seed of the white varieties of French bean, boiled quite tender, and rubbed through a strainer to divest them of their skins, and mixed with 2/3 of their weight of flour or meal, will make bread which in flavour and appearance can scarcely be known from genuine wheaten bread. And as the bean is one of the most nutritious by far of all vegetables, it will replace very advantageously a portion of wheat flour for persons whose digestion is not extremely delicate. By those who are out of health, this bread is perhaps better avoided. Footnote. The French bean seed, known as haricot blanc, served so abundantly at foreign tables, and very much now in England also, is not considered, even where it is so much eaten, as well adapted to invalids. When quite fresh, it is less objectionable than after it is harvested for winter consumption. End footnote. After the beans have been prepared as above, the pulp from them should be intimately mixed with the flour or meal, and the bread finished in the usual way. It will be seen, as the dough is gradually moistened, that less liquid will be required for it than for common wheaten bread. But the exact difference cannot easily be specified. The dough should be mixed entirely at once, and be made rather firm. The seed of the scarlet runner, or any other coloured variety of the vegetable, if the flavour were not strong, would probably answer as well as the white, particularly for brown bread. Pulp of white French beans, haricot blanc, 1 pound. Wheat flour or meal, 2 pounds. Made into dough with the common proportion of yeast, rather less liquid, and a little more salt. Fermented and baked like other bread. Parsnip and other vegetable bread. Many vegetables may be used in part for making bread, but it is only in cases of real need that such an expedient is recommended. When corn is unusually dear, the produce of a kitchen garden or of an allotment ground will serve, in combination with it, to furnish wholesome bread. But, with the exception of potatoes and the seed of the French bean, all vegetables will impart their peculiar flavour to it, though their presence may not otherwise be perceptible. Parsnips, Swedish turnips, and beetroot will all answer for dough. Parsnips the best of any, if boiled tender, mashed to a smooth pulp, and stirred in a saucepan over a gentle fire until tolerably dry, and left to become cool before they are mixed with flour or meal for the purpose. Footnote. The beetroot, which may also be baked, must be grated. End footnote. Bread of Indian corn flour. half Indian flour and half wheaten flour, made and managed like common dough, and baked in a moderate oven, will produce good and economical bread. The meal is sometimes scalded before it is mixed with the flour. Footnote. One peculiarity of the maize is its becoming difficult to convert into various preparations if quite boiling liquid be previously mixed with it. Half a pint of cold water to a quart taken in full ebullition will cool it down sufficiently. End footnote. But it is then rather less pleasant in flavour, and a little more difficult to preserve of a proper consistence, as it will absorb as much liquid as will be required for the bread altogether. The yeast must therefore be stirred to it when it is at the proper degree of warmth, and the flour worked in immediately after. No bread, of which Indian corn forms a part, should be baked in a very hot oven. 1/3 only of sound yellow maize flour, with 2/3 of wheat flour, will form a mixture which will generally be liked, and with which it is perhaps better to begin the use of Indian corn until the taste is a little accustomed to it. Unfermented bread. The most perfectly wholesome kind of unfermented bread is that made with muriatic acid and carbonate of soda, of which the combination forms common salt, and cannot therefore be any way unhealthful, though it is often denounced by ignorant people as such. Footnote. I have in my possession a pamphlet written by a baker who has received the marked public testimony of a scientific man of repute as to the purity of his bread, in which he attacks his brethren of the trade rather vehemently as poisoners of the people, etc., etc. In his list of wicked adulterations, muriatic acid is included. End footnote. But until some experience has been gained, there will be a chance of failure in this bread, in consequence of the variation in the strength and quality of the acid, which must have just sufficient power to neutralize the soda, and evolve the necessary portion of carbonic acid gas for rendering it light, without either ingredient being in such excess as to impart its flavor, in the slightest degree, to the dough. The soda, which should be of the best kind, and in fine powder, should be rubbed through a hair sieve with a wooden spoon into the flour, and mixed intimately with it before the acid is poured in. The proper proportions of all the ingredients will be found, with directions for mixing them, at page 100. Both brown bread and white may be made in the same manner, and should be well but quickly kneaded as soon as they have been mingled, so far as they can be with a large, strong wooden spoon. No metal should be used in the process. The loaves should be expeditiously made, and set into a moderately heated oven without the least delay. Unfermented bread made with tartaric acid. Though perhaps not well adapted for long-continued consumption, this bread, which is more easily made with perfect success than the preceding, may be eaten occasionally without any disadvantage. For each pound of flour, allow 1 dram of bicarbonate of soda, and rub it through a sieve over the pan which contains it, and stir them together until the soda is equally distributed amongst it. Dissolve 50 grains of tartaric acid in half a pint of water. Knead it up well, but very quickly, and place it in the oven the instant it is ready. Salt must be added to this bread as for common dough, but none is required for that which is made with the muriatic acid. A very small portion of pounded sugar is an improvement to it, about half a teaspoonful to the pound of flour. For delicious bread made with tartaric acid and buttermilk, see Dairy Bread, page 147. Crusts to serve with cheese. Take a half-baked loaf from the oven and tear it into small rough bits with a couple of forks. Lay these on a tin and put them back into the oven for 10 minutes. If a light loaf be made for the purpose, with new milk and 2 ounces of butter, they will quite resemble rusks. A sweet light cake pulled apart in the same manner is likewise very good. Loaves of different forms. The common shape of baker's loaves is given by dividing the portion of dough intended for one loaf into 2 parts of unequal size, the smaller one being little more than a third of the whole. These are made into the form of very thick cakes, and then placed one on the other, care being taken that there shall be no flour between them, and then pressed together, and a deep indentation made in the centre of the upper one, sometimes by the baker's elbow. The loaves, technically called bricks, which are baked in tins, are of convenient form for making toast or for slicing bread and butter. Crusty or college loaves. These are more frequently made in private families than for sale. The dough for them should be tolerably firm, and be first moulded and slightly cut round in the usual manner. And then, with a sharp knife, the tops should be divided into large dice of equal size, the paste being cut down nearly half through to form them. They will spread open in the baking, and furnish plenty of nice, crisp, square crusts for amateurs. French loaves. In France, the usual form given to common bread is that of a rouleau, or cylinder, which spreads and flattens a little in the baking. The loaves are sometimes 2 or 3 feet in length. One advantage of having them moulded thus is that they are more perfectly and regularly baked than loaves of massive construction. Some few London bakers have adopted the French shape for their bread. Extracts from the report of the Medical Officer of Health for the District of Holborn on the adulteration of bread, March 16, 1857. It is with no wish to exaggerate the importance of any fact connected with the subject of bread adulterations that I return to it here, but because the opinions expressed upon it in the following passages of Dr. Gibbon's report appear worthy of general respect and consideration, and, so far as the bakers are concerned, they are written in a most frank and liberal spirit. It is my deliberate opinion that, although alum is not a poison, yet that its use in the manufacture of bread is injurious to health, and concurs indirectly with other things in increasing the mortality, especially of young children, the staple article of whose dietary is bread. The more effectually to discountenance this practice, I will briefly detail some of the grounds whereon this opinion is founded. It is well known that small doses of alum repeated for a considerable time will produce at first costiveness, and afterwards great irregularity of the bowels. The quantity of alum which I have generally met with in bread has been in the proportion of from half a dram to 1 dram in the 4-pound loaf, so that the man who consumes half a loaf a day swallows every 24 hours from 15 to 30 grains of alum. Now, it is found that even 12 grains per diem taken by a healthy adult will produce constipation. Its effects on children would, of course, be greater than on adults. A smaller quantity would suffice to produce the diarrhea and dysenteric symptoms, and they would appear sooner. Alum enters into chemical combination with the gluten of the flour. Therefore, I admit that its effects in bread are less active and injurious than when administered in its pure state. I have little hesitation, however, in assigning this impurity in the bread as the chief cause of the frequent constipation, headaches, liver derangements, etc., of those who are dependent on bakers for their bread. The fatal diarrhea of infants under 3 years of age may also have arisen from or have been aggravated by this cause. As this adulteration has been practiced for a very great length of time, I cannot recommend the adoption of any harsh measures for its suppression. I would suggest that all bakers in the district should be cautioned against it. If any flagrant case occurs where the injury to health is clearly made out, I shall feel it to be my duty to advise your board to take the necessary proceedings to prevent its recurrence. When the bakers are duly informed of this opinion, I am in hopes that they will of their own accord cease to use alum in making bread. The baker's plea at present is that it is harmless, that the public like it, and will have it, so that the more effectually to put down an adulteration which is injurious to health, the public on their part should cease to set so high a value on those qualities in a loaf which alum is used to produce. The following particulars will, I trust, enable the purchaser to distinguish a loaf that does not contain alum from one which does. Alum increases the whiteness and firmness of the bread made from inferior flour, and thereby causes it to resemble bread made from the very best flour. The qualities which alum imparts to a loaf are very unimportant, having reference merely to the appearance, lightness, neatness of shape, etc. The chemical action of alum on moistened flour is analogous to tanning, and destroys in a considerable degree its nutritiveness. It converts the gluten, the most nutritious portion of the flour, into a kind of tough, tenacious wash leather, which is difficult of digestion. This gives the dough a tenacity and firmness, enabling it to retain the thousands of little air bubbles, given off by the yeast, which constitute the lightness or spongy porous character of the bread. Hence, flour that will not rise may be made to do so by means of alum. Another object in the use of alum is that it preserves the upright form of the loaves, and prevents them from adhering firmly together, thereby enabling the baker to separate them more readily on their removal from the oven. The batch parts clean, as the expression is, without tearing. An unalumed loaf is, with a little practice, distinguishable from an alumed one by its appearance alone. It is wanting in all those peculiarities which I have mentioned as the effects of alum. It is not so bulky, nor so symmetrical in its shape. Its sides are roughened and torn in being separated from the batch. Unalumed bread bites short. Alumed bread bites tough, and the rough, sour taste of alum is slightly perceptible in it. The most marked contrast, however, is apparent in crumbling when a day or two old. Unalumed bread crumbles with the greatest facility by rubbing it between the hands, whereas alumed bread, however old, crumbles with difficulty. In the same way, alum renders the new loaf less liable to crumble when cut. These, then, are the qualities and appearances in a loaf which I recommend the purchaser to disregard. Septimus Gibbon, M.D., Medical Officer of Health. Bread associations. There are now in various parts of the continent, in France and Belgium more particularly, subscription bakeries, or as they call them, friendly bread associations. Which are reported to answer remarkably well in every respect. Footnote. An establishment of the same nature exists, I believe, at Manchester or Birmingham. Some notice of it was given by one of the subscribers in the Times not very long since, but the particulars have escaped my recollection, and I cannot recall the date of the journal which contained them. End footnote. Some of them are on a small scale and conducted on a plan which enables persons of very limited means to profit by their advantages. The subscriptions, which can be constantly renewed, do not exceed 8 or 10 shillings, and bread, sufficient for the daily consumption of a family, is supplied to that amount until it is exhausted, much better in quality and rather lower in price than that sold by the bakers. The wheat, as in the large factories already mentioned, is purchased of the grower, by which a considerable saving is effected, and the genuineness of the bread is secured. And the profits which arise from the suppression of all unnecessary expenses, after a time are divided amongst the subscribers. When a building has to be purchased or erected in the first instance for the bakery, and all the accessories for the fabrication of the bread have also to be purchased, a certain period must elapse before any clear profits can be expected, beyond those which are in reality afforded by the purity and cost of the bread furnished to the members of the association. A thorough knowledge of practical business details is, of course, necessary in organizing these friendly companies, and an entire absence of what is familiarly called jobbing, and which is said to prevent the satisfactory working of many enterprises in this country. New French process for converting wheat into white bread. To supply the labouring part of the population of Paris with the fine white bread with which alone they will be satisfied, has become an object of natural anxiety in that capital, now that provisions of all kinds have risen to so very high a price there, and the first scientific men of the day are seeking to discover processes, by means of which this false taste may be gratified at a less serious cost than it is at present. As real popular education advances and people are brought to see the truth of things, as it becomes more and more developed by the aid of science, and by the efforts of enlarged and enlightened minds, it is probable that the deeply rooted prejudices, which have their origin often in profound ignorance, that now stand opposed to much of what is best and most profitable as food, will give place, with many others, to a just appreciation of convincingly exposed facts. The man who understands the nature of the component parts of wheat will not quarrel with the mere colour of the bread he eats, when he knows that it is not the result of any sophistication of the materials of which it is composed. He will not insist on the sacrifice of a large portion of the grain, the whole of which is so important to him as nutriment, merely to gratify an irrational prepossession in favour of white bread. In England, and in London more particularly, amongst the working classes, this prepossession exists quite as generally as in any part of the world, the consumption of brown bread being confined almost entirely to the families of the more affluent order. Only a cursory mention can now be made here of the recent discoveries, reported at considerable length to the Académie des Sciences at its meeting of January 12, 1857, and published in the Moniteur Universel of the 20th, and in other French journals most probably, and partly also in the form of a slight pamphlet entitled Extraction and Conversion of the Whole of the Flour of Wheat into White Bread of the First Quality, by Monsieur Mouret, to be had of Messieurs Firmin Didot Frères, Librairie, and of the author, Rue Jacob, 19. A short extract or two from the above-named report may give the reader some idea of its tendency and of its claim to attention. Chemistry applied to panification. Report made to the Academy of Science of a memorial by Monsieur Mouret, entitled Chemical Researches on Wheat, Flour, and Bread-Making. At its sitting of June 9, 1856, Monsieur Mouret presented to the Academy the result of his researches on panification, partly theoretical and partly practical. Partly theoretical, because the author explains the real cause of the dark hue of brown bread, and indicates the manner by which it may be avoided, even when the bran is left in the dough. Partly practical, because he proposes a new system of panification, which is something more than a mere project. Since one of the colleges of Paris has for 3 months past been supplied with the bread made by it, and the occupants of the orphan asylum of Saint Charles, of the 12th arrondissement, have lived on it since last June to the exclusion of all other. It must be observed here that the Académie des Sciences has naturally much influence with the French government on questions of this nature, and that it considered the discoveries of Monsieur Mouret of sufficient importance to appoint a commission to ascertain their practical value. And this commission, after having seen his new processes in all their details, carried into operation at a small bakery, which he had himself established, applied to the prefect of the Seine for permission to have them tested by more extensive experiments at the bakery of the hospitals of Paris, which was immediately accorded, and they were placed in communication with Monsieur Salon, the director of the Boulangerie de Scipion, in conjunction with whom Monsieur Mouret pursued his labours until a definite result was obtained for the further investigation of the commissioners, who then proceeded with their examinations. The positive advantages afforded by the new system appear to be the deriving from 17 to 20% more of fine white bread from wheat than is commonly done, and reducing to comparative simplicity the present most elaborate and tedious method of making it, of which the following account will give an idea. In a modified degree, the same plan is pursued by the baking trade of England. The intelligent reader will judge how far it is favourable to the production of sweet and nutritious bread. Common mode of panification practised in Paris. The white bread of Paris is made with the best flour. If 100 parts of wheat have yielded 70 of flour, it is said to be bolted to 70, which is the quality used for the consumers of that capital. This is the process. At 8 o'clock in the evening, a bit of paste is taken, composed of 8 kilograms of flour and 4 kilograms of water. Footnote. This is probably a portion of the paste called leaven. If it were merely flour and water, it would not become a ferment in so short a time. Many days' keeping in a certain temperature would be required to produce spontaneous fermentation in it. Formerly, this kind of leaven, which always imparts a certain degree of acidity to bread, was used commonly in England, and it is so still in various parts of the continent. After the first preparation of the ferment, a bit of the dough made with it is kept from one baking to another, well covered with flour, and serves the purpose of yeast when well kneaded up with the other ingredients. End footnote. Footnote: 16 pounds of flour and 4 quarts of water. The gram is the 30th part of an ounce. End footnote. This is left until 6 o'clock in the morning, and constitutes the main leaven, levain de chef. 8 kilograms more of flour and 4 kilograms of water are then added. This forms the leaven of the first degree. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, 16 kilograms of flour and 8 of water are added. This is the second quality of leaven. At 5 o'clock, the complete leaven is prepared by adding 100 pounds of flour and 52 kilograms of water, mixed with from 200 to 300 grams of yeast, levure. At 7 o'clock, 132 kilograms of flour and 68 kilograms of water, holding in solution 2 kilograms of salt, and mixed with from 300 to 600 grams of yeast, are added to the leaven and made into well-kneaded dough. With this quantity of paste, 5 or 6 batches of bread are made in the following manner. First batch. This is composed of half the dough prepared as above, which is molded and left to rise, and then set into the oven. The bread of this first baking is sour, aigre, rather brown, and not particularly light. Second batch. The dough remaining of the first batch is mixed with 132 kilograms more of flour and 68 kilograms of water, mixed with the same proportion of salt and yeast as the preceding batch. Half of this dough forms the second baking, the bread of which is whiter and better than the first. Third batch. The same quantity of flour, water, and salt, with 300 grams of yeast, are again added to the dough, of which half is baked as usual. Fourth batch. Same proceeding as for the third. Fifth batch. This is prepared like the foregoing, and produces what is called fancy bread, pain de luxe, the finest quality of any. I have used the word yeast as we understand it in English for the levure mentioned in the process, though it may possibly differ from that which is commonly used amongst us. Footnote: if beer yeast had been meant, it would probably have been called levure de bière. End footnote. The papers relative to Monsieur Megmoret's discoveries, though published some months since, have reached me only just in time to permit of this very slight notice, leaving no means of ascertaining any particulars about them. The chief novelty which they disclose is the existence in wheat of a strongly fermenting principle which he calls céréaline, of which the action gives, he asserts, its brown colour to bread. It is not possible to condense the substance of the report, from which I have taken the short extracts inserted here, in such a manner as to render its scientific and practical details intelligible, and to adapt it, at the same time, for admission into this small volume, brought at present so near its conclusion. But if real and great advantages are to be derived from the introduction of new processes, by which Monsieur Megmoret is endeavouring to replace the old ones, they will soon become extensively known, and will scarcely fail to attract the attention of the persons most interested in the important question of bread improvement, which is beginning, at least, to create the general and active interest which it deserves. Monsieur Mourier has drawn his conclusions from the closest anatomical inspection of the grain of wheat, confirmed by microscopical examinations of it, made conjointly with him by a clever young botanist named Trécul, highly considered by the Academy. The position of the cells which contain the céréaline, which has been a principal object of experiment to the first of these gentlemen, is minutely described, together with its nature and the method of partly or entirely neutralizing its activity in panification, in which it exercises a powerful decomposing influence in its natural state. It is asserted that the brown color of bread is not attributable to the mixture of bran or pollard with the flour, but to the energetic fermentation produced by the céréaline. Public ovens for baking bread and for general cookery. The establishment of large, well-regulated public ovens, to which the bread and other food of families could be taken to be baked, without danger of loss from dishonesty or mismanagement, would be an inestimable boon to the labouring classes of the English people, and a valuable one to many others. And if the charge of such ovens were entrusted to persons who combined integrity and intelligence, with a due knowledge of the practical operations required from them, a new and profitable system of cookery might be generally adopted through their means, by the agency of a low but equally sustained degree of temperature. When enclosed in earthen jars with covers, or other suitable vessels, pasted down or secured in such a manner as to prevent the escape of the steam arising from them, and mingled with so much liquid only as is necessary for their preparation, meat, fish, fruit, rice, and an infinite variety of other articles of food may be cooked in the very best manner, and without the loss of any portion of the nourishment which they contain. Footnote: the value and wholesomeness of rice as food depend entirely on the mode of preparing it, which is ill understood in this country, and to which the above system is peculiarly adapted. End footnote. A thick layer of pie crust will often be a convenient substitute for the cover of a jar in baking these, and will effectually confine the steam if carefully fastened to the edge. The favourite but most unfrugal baked joints of meat of the people, on which often a large portion of a poor man's weekly wages is expended for one day's meal only, have been too often the subject of comment and remonstrance, for their wastefulness not to be generally recognized. And yet one would not willingly deprive those who have so few enjoyments of the occasional savoury repasts, which many of them earn with the heaviest labour, and for which they seem content frequently to pay the price of many days of comparative privation. Much greater economy, however, might be effected even in the baked meats, for which the common national taste is so decided, and which dwindle in size so strikingly in the overheated ovens of the bakers. They would be infinitely more succulent and nutritious, or more really resembling well-roasted meat, in fact, if long and gently cooked, and would lose far less in weight. In various populous places it might answer to have several ovens in the same office, varying in their degrees of temperature, and so adapted to, and always ready at certain hours, for different preparations. But it is most of all in many of our villages that better accommodation is required than now exists for baking generally, and for baking bread especially. For great discouragement to the makers often attends the sending it to a common baker's oven, should there chance to be one at hand, which in many instances there is not. It is a real grievance to the poor but industrious housewife to have the dough which she has prepared carefully and well, given back to her either underbaked or burned or partially spoiled, by standing for hours in the heated air of the bake-office after it was ready for the oven. It is a disadvantage, under any circumstances, to be compelled to send bread from home to be baked, and in severely cold weather there is always a chance, unless great precautions be taken against it, of the dough being rendered heavy by exposure to the influence of the external air. The rich, who interest themselves in the well-being of the poor, would effect a good work in their favour by aiding in the erection of village bakeries, which should remove the present difficulties of numbers of the rural population. But no beneficial results would ensue unless their management were entrusted to kind, conscientious, and efficient agents. To cleanse wheat for grinding. I extract the following passage from a small pamphlet which has just fallen into my hands, entitled Our Dairy Bread, written and published by Mr. William Horsell, 492 New Oxford Street. Because it appears to me to contain a simple and sensible suggestion for the improvement of bread, and in consequence to deserve consideration. Those who have given little attention to this subject will probably think that the trouble of washing all their breadstuff before it is ground would be much greater than any benefit which would result from it. But a short experience in the matter would convince everyone who has a proper regard for the character of his bread that the trouble of washing his grain bears no comparison to the improvement effected by it. Indeed, those who have been accustomed to wash their grain will soon cease to regard it as a trouble, and the improvement in the whiteness and sweetness of their bread will be so great that they would be very unwilling to give up the practice. Having raised or purchased a quantity of the best new wheat, it should be put away in clean casks or bins where it will keep perfectly dry and sweet, and according to the size of the family, take, as they need it, 1 or 2 bushels, and wash it thoroughly but briskly in 2 or 3 waters, and then spread it out on the drying sheet or table, made for the purpose, and which is considerably inclined, so that the water remaining with the wheat will easily run off. Being thinly spread out upon the sheet or table in a good drying day, it will be sufficiently dry in a few hours for grinding. Let anyone who loves good bread wash his grain a few times in this manner, and he will be very reluctant to return to the use of bread made of unwashed grain. Pure baker's bread. It is with the greatest satisfaction that I find myself enabled to mention, before I close this work entirely, a movement which has commenced amongst the better order of bakers for supplying the public with really genuine bread. Some specimens have been sent to me which were truly excellent, and which remained good for so unusual a length of time, that I have no doubt they had been fabricated in a perfectly wholesome manner. It would perhaps be only fair to give the names of those members of the trade who are foremost in the path of improvement, but believing that many others will quickly unite with them in their good and conscientious work, I prefer to wait a little before I add anything to this slight notice of a welcome fact. Deficient weight of bread. This is an evil which presses so heavily and painfully on the very poor, and which prevails, I regret to state, to so serious an extent that I cannot withhold a few words of comment upon it, trusting sincerely that it will be one of the first abuses which the reforming spirit of the age will entirely abolish. It is not sufficient for genuine bread to be supplied to the public, if the full value of the price exacted for it be not given in its weight as well. And the instances in which all that I have had tested, and which has been purchased of various bakers, has come up to the proper standard, have been very few. There may be some difficulty, perhaps, in having it always exact to an ounce, but 5 or 6 ounces of loss in every 4-pound loaf, which is the average deficiency, is a serious consideration to the poor and scantily fed, and there is never any overplus of weight to make them compensation for it. Bread chips, to serve instead of biscuits for dessert, or to invalids. Cut thin shavings of bread from a stale loaf, spread them on a dish, or lay them singly on the tin tray of an American oven, and dry them very gradually until they are perfectly crisp. Then bring them to a pale straw colour. Withdraw them from the fire, and as soon as they are cold, pile them on a napkin, and serve them without delay. They require an extremely gentle oven to produce the proper effect on them, but, if well managed, will retain their crispness for several hours, and it may always be renewed by heating them through afresh. By many persons they are much preferred to biscuits, being considered far more delicate. A small American oven answers for them extremely well if placed at a distance from the fire. They require quite half an hour to dry them as they ought to be done. The End. London. Printed by Spottiswoode and Company, New Street Square. FINIS. That is the end of the English Bread Book by Eliza Acton.